So what's led you to the point of publicly affirming your faith in Jesus Christ today? I asked the rather burly furniture removals man sitting opposite me in the vestry shortly before the confirmation service was due to begin. A couple of years ago, he responded, I noticed a lump growing down below. He gave a few graphic details for which I'll spare you, and for the next few weeks it kept on growing. My wife said I really must see the doctor about it, but I was too scared. One day we were helping a family move house, and they had one of those big old family Bibles. It weighed a ton. And as I put the Bible in the van, I found myself praying for the first time in my life, God, if you're out there, get rid of this lump. I didn't think much more about it until the next morning when the lump had completely gone. Blimey, I said to myself, I better start going to church. So I did, and the family came too, and we've been coming ever since. It was one of those rich and unexpected moments in the life of a bishop, and introduces us neatly to the theme of this week, which is the role of God's power in the growth of the Christian believer. Both the so-called signs and wonders that we read about in the pages of the New Testament, of which my burly removals man was a modern-day example, and the power that releases individuals into new ways of being and behaving, which equally made such a marked impact on the ancient world and continues to do so today. There's a phrase that occurs 5 times in the pages of the New Testament, once in each of its first 5 books. And the phrase is this: stretch out your hand. 3 of them relate to the same story recorded in Matthew, Mark and Luke, where Jesus healed a man with a withered hand, provoking the anger of some of his critics by daring to do so on the Sabbath. Another relates to Jesus' final encounter with Peter in John's Gospel. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. And the final one picks up on one of the prayers at a powerful meeting in the book of Acts, shortly after Peter and John had been arrested, then released. Stretch out your hand to heal, went the prayer, so that signs and wonders are performed through the name of your servant Jesus. The book of Acts is full of such signs and wonders, starting with the healing of a lame man in the middle of Jerusalem and continuing through the ministries of Peter, Stephen, Paul and others. Some of those who were healed are recorded by name, no doubt because they were well-loved members of their local churches. Luke tells the stories of bedridden Aeneas and the godly Tabitha, for example, with real affection, as well as recording the powerful impact of those stories as they became widely circulated. Meanwhile, St. Paul's battles with the forces of evil in Ephesus are powerfully recorded in Acts chapter 19, culminating in a mighty bonfire of occult materials and a slump in the sales of the statue of the goddess Artemis. Healings and miracles are part of what happens when God stretches out his hand in signs and wonders. But we also read of transformed lives and value systems through the work of God's Spirit. There are those beautiful portraits of the early church in the first few chapters of Luke's book, where everyone shared everything in common and there wasn't a needy person among them. And there's the biggest transformation of them all a few chapters later, as a zealous young rabbi is stopped in his tracks on his way to Damascus. Reading the early church fathers, we see these themes developed further. St. Augustine, for example, was initially sceptical about the healing stories that came his way, but later changed his mind. I realised how many miracles were occurring in my own day, he writes, and how wrong it would be to allow the memory of these marvels to perish from among our people. It is only 2 years ago that the keeping of records was begun here in Hippo, and already we have nearly 70 attested miracles. Meanwhile, Tertullian, another North African writing 200 years earlier, reflected too on the power of the gospel to transform people's lives and behaviour. Writing in defence of the church against its Roman persecutors, he put it like this: "No one considers how great a loss it is to the empire when people as virtuous as we are put to death in such numbers. In your long lists of those accused of various atrocities, has any assassin, any thief, anyone guilty of sacrilege or seduction or stealing bathers' clothes ever been named as a Christian too? It's always with your folk, the Romans, that the prison is steaming, the mines are sighing, the wild beasts are fed. It is from you that the organisers of the circus get their herds of criminals to feed up for the occasion. You will find no Christian there unless they are simply there because they are Christians. And it's not that the early church was perfect, of course, and nor is it that everyone that they prayed for was miraculously healed. But there was a sense of expectancy and openness to the living God that we sometimes lack today. When they prayed, "The Lord is here, God's Spirit is with us," they really meant it. I wonder whether that should be our challenge in this third week of Lent, especially if the pandemic has subtly undermined our confidence in the living God. A challenge to reconnect with the God who heals, who transforms, the God of power and might. There is no real conflict between this worldview and that of the doctors and the scientists. Along with the author of the book of Ecclesiasticus, we can rejoice that, quote, "The Lord created medicines out of the earth, and the sensible will not despise them. And he gives skill to human beings, that he might be glorified in all his marvellous works." A passage that I'm sure Luke the doctor cherished and probably knew by heart. There is no essential conflict either between God's power to heal and the reality that some of those for whom we pray will sicken and die, however painful and distressing that may often be. St. John's reference to the phrase, "Stretch out your hand," after all, relates not to Peter's healing, but to his martyrdom. And at times of grief in particular, how important to remember that for the Christian, death is the ultimate healing. And that what we experience now of the presence and power of God is just the foretaste of the glories that are to come, the crisps and the nuts, if you like, before the real banquet begins. And so I'd like us to turn to Acts chapter 4 and to Luke's account of that powerful meeting in which the early Christians prayed for God to stretch out his hand in signs and wonders. That is Acts chapter 2, verses 23 to 31. You may remember the context here, how the apostles Peter and John had been arrested following the healing of the man by the so-called Beautiful Gate, and had been dragged in front of just the people who earlier that year had condemned Jesus to death, the notorious Annas and Caiaphas. Amazingly, the apostles refused to be intimidated and were released, at which point Luke records a gathering of the disciples for prayer. Once again, I've written a few questions to help you reflect on this passage more deeply, and may the living God bless and renew you as you read his word together now.